My name is Bill Schaberg. I'm the author of a book, Writing the Big Book, The Creation of A.A. It was published in the first week of November coming up. It'll be 4 years. And it's my book especially focuses on October 1937, the first time they mentioned the book, and April of 1939 when they published the book. Today, I'm going to expand that a little bit. I want to talk about what I see as the historical evolution of religious to spiritual in Alcoholics Anonymous in the early years. But before talking about the evolution of religion to spirituality in early AA history, I think it's important to dispel two very, very, very dominant myths in AA that constantly contaminate any discussion of this topic, completely contaminate it. There seems to be this common belief in AA that Bill Wilson just rolled out of bed in Towns Hospital after having his white light experience in December of 1934. And he was already preaching a very liberal God as we understand him message. That was the formula, of course, which was so important to the worldwide success of Alcoholics Anonymous. But nothing, honestly, in my opinion, nothing could be any farther from the truth. On that day in mid-December of 1934, Bill had no idea about those open-ended options for belief that were going to become so famous through Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's going to be, and that was, it turned out to be, that was the unique solution that AA offered to the world. Bill always called that God as we understand him openness, a 10 strike. That was a bowling term. That was one ball, all the pins go down, 10 strike. You just have to remember that Wilson himself called the period from December 1934, when he got sober, and April 1939, when the book was published, the flying blind period. And it was called the flying blind period because they really had no idea what they were doing. They were basically taking a very pragmatic approach to this problem of how do we get people to stop drinking. And they would try things and it would work, and they'd say, okay, we got to keep doing that. And they would do other things and they didn't work. And they said, okay, we got to stop doing that. It was a very, very pragmatic approach during this flying blind period. It was a time for experimenting on what worked and what didn't work. And the starting place for all of those earliest experiences were all profoundly and deeply religious. They wouldn't fit the model that we would talk about today in AA about it being a spiritual solution. It was a religious solution. So to begin at the beginning of that long journey from religious to spiritual, and I just forewarn you, this is, we're going to have to wade through a lot of religion before we get to the spiritual, because that's how it worked out temporally. So let's start with Bill Wilson in Towns Hospital in December of 1934. And it's right here in Bill's last drunken trip to Towns Hospital that we just have to stop and spend a little bit of time unpacking several of the stories that are so frequently told about Bill's last visit to the hospital. One of the most persistent myths, and I call them myths very decidedly and pointedly and selectively, and that's why it's all in capital letters and bold, are the myths that grow out of AA. Is the story of Ebby Thacher giving Bill Wilson a copy of William James's The Varieties of Religious Experience immediately after Bill had his white light experience in Towns Hospital. Now, the traditional story says that Ebby gave Bill a copy of Varieties in Towns Hospital, which Bill then supposedly read right through before leaving Towns Hospital. And this created Bill's vision of a religious cure for alcoholism based on the idea that you could just choose your own conception of God. There it was right there. Bill rolls out of bed, leaves Towns Hospital, and he's on a crusade to preach this liberal vision of sobriety that he's picked up by reading William James's book. Now, that story is largely based on Bill's 1954 recording that he did, and it was published in 2000 in a book called My First 40 Years, where in that book he says that Ebby gave him varieties that day after his white light experience. And Ebby tells Bill as he hands him the book, he says, look, I haven't read much of this myself, but Ebby says, that some of his Oxford group friends thought this was a great book for Bill to have because it was such a fine explanation of religious conversion. So that was the point. He's given him the book because his Oxford group friends had told him it's a fine explanation of religious conversion. We got Bill, who had been a non-believer, just had this white light experience, and we're trying to convince Bill this was a valid thing for him, that he had this encounter with God. So that's the reason they were supposedly giving him the book. In that same 1954 talk, Bill claimed that the moment Ebby left, I picked up the book and commenced to read. The moment Ebby left, I started reading that book. It was not an easy read, but I kept at it all day. And by nightfall, William James had become a founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. So Bill's really claiming here in 1954, 20 years after the fact, that this whole liberal God as I understand him concept came to him that night, and he adopted it from that point going forward. Personally, I don't believe a word of that story. Have you ever tried to read The Varieties of Religious Experience? Have you ever picked up that book and given it a shot? I've read it a couple of times. I'm a very big William James fan. I've read a lot of William James. I like the book, but I'm telling you, smart people with long-time sobriety frequently tell me they can't make any sense out of that book. They keep going at it and they can't make any sense out of it. But Bill, our sainted founder, Bill Wilson, he who must have been walking on water that day, supposedly read through the book, and he was powerfully inspired by a brilliant vision of AA's future from his reading of Varieties of Religious Experience when he was just a day or two sober. He's a couple of days away from the belladonna treatment and one day away from a white light experience, but he's got it. Really? Really? I think that's a big story to swallow when you look at it with any kind of squinted eye. When challenged on the absurd, what I consider the absurd idea that Bill read and understood that whole book when in Towns Hospital, people who are really, really committed to this story, and there's a bunch of people really committed to this story, they start backpedaling and they say, oh, well, what Ebby did was he just put a bookmark in this chapter in there. Chapter 9 is on conversion. And that's what he wanted Bill to read, not the whole book. He just asked Bill to read conversion. That's probably all Bill read was that one chapter, conversion. And because you got to remember, Bill said in that 1954 talk that Ebby had told him that the book would provide a fine explanation of religious conversion. So these people say, okay, that's what he was doing. He was reading the chapter on conversion. Now, I suspect that even reading just that 28-page chapter with any kind of meaningful comprehension, I would challenge you to do that, would have been a significant challenge to Bill's his still seriously befogged mind. On the East Coast here in Connecticut, we talk about being mocus. Young people who are brand new in the program, we say they're mocus. You can't barely make any sense out of anything. You can't read a paragraph of the big book and make any sense out of it. You're mocus, you're befogged. And but Wilson, he ripped right through Varieties of Religious Experience right there. Personally, I believe that Ebby gave Bill that book and suggested that he read just 2 pages of the conversion chapter. Then those 2 pages were devoted to the story of another drunk's white light experience. Ebby was trying to convince Bill that this experience he had just had of his experience of touching the face of God, if you will, was in fact a valid experience and something he could build on going forward. So I think he did this because he felt that Samuel Hadley, that was the guy's story, it's a 2-page story in Varieties, Samuel Hadley's story of his own white light experience would reassure Bill Wilson that he wasn't crazy. And Wilson was worried he was crazy. He'd even talked to Dr. Silkworth and said, am I out of my mind here? This thing just happened to me. I can't make any sense out of it. Am I crazy? Ebby didn't want him to think he was crazy. Ebby wanted him to think he had had a genuine religious awakening. Wanted to make sure that Bill realized that this white light experience was a real and valid thing. This explanation is one. Now, this makes sense to me. Okay, Ebby gives him the book and says, read the conversion. If you can't make any sense out of the conversion chapter, please read that 2 pages there about Hadley. But given that scenario, it's important to note that Hadley was very explicit about the Christian foundations of his white light experience. And this is what he says in the Varieties. He says, with a breaking heart, I said, dear Jesus, can you help me? And then he says, after that, I felt the glorious brightness of a noonday sun shine into my heart. Sounds a little familiar if you've read about Bill's own white light experience in Towns Hospital. But please note well the explicit Jesus element in Hadley's story. It's one that Ebby Thacher very much wanted to bring to Bill Wilson's attention, and it's the reason I believe he handed him this book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. Such an explanation of Bill's white light experience would fit perfectly with the Oxford group practices and beliefs. This is going to be Bill's entree into the Oxford group, which is how Ebby got sober. Ebby was preaching exactly those Oxford group practices and beliefs to Bill Wilson before he got to Towns Hospital, the famous over-the-table meeting. I got religion. Well, what religion did you get, Ebby? I got the Oxford group religion. That's what I got. And that's what he was talking about over the kitchen table. And that's what he was talking to Bill about when he visited him at Towns Hospital with a whole bunch of Oxford group guys who visited him at Towns Hospital. But you say, But, oh, whoa. You say, that's not the story that we're told about Ebby's hospital visits when we read Bill's story in the big book. That's not how it works. He's not talking Oxford group stuff to him. No, it's not the story you see in the big book. And that's because Ebby's bedside conversation with Bill Wilson about famously saying, well, why don't you choose your own conception of God? This very open, liberal approach that's going to start right here in December 1934 at Bill's bedside. Why don't you choose your own conception of God? Was added. It was added to Bill Wilson's story, Bill's story, by Hank Parkhurst, just weeks before the big book went to print on April 10th, 1939. That story was added in March of 1939 to Bill Wilson's story. We're going to have a lot more details on that later. So I spent all this time on these two very persistent AA myths. The first one, that Bill Wilson adopted a liberal William James Variety of Religious Experience approach to religion right from the jump street, his final visit at Towns Hospital, and that while he was at Towns Hospital, Ebby was preaching a liberal, why don't you choose your own conception of God vision of religion to him while he was there. I consider both of those black and white myths, just absolutely untrue stories. Didn't happen that way. Because I spent the time on it because so many people in AA are so deeply invested in those two myths. They desperately want to believe that AA had this very open approach to religion and to spirituality right from the very beginning. But that belief, however much people may want to believe it, is absolutely and undeniably, it's wrong. It's not true. So let's take a look at what really happened in those very early days. What was really going on? What are the documents that were written and the things that were said in those particular times tell us about what was going on in early Alcoholics Anonymous? When Ebby showed up at Bill's house in November and at Towns Hospital in December of 34, he was telling Bill about how he was staying sober with the teachings of the Oxford group. And it was those teachings that exclusively fueled Ebby's sobriety and everyone else's sobriety for the next 2.5 years of the growing fellowship around these people who weren't drinking. So, what was the basic teachings of the Oxford group at this time? The Oxford group was what's called a first century Christian movement. There's been a number of these throughout history, for 2,000 years since Christian. But this is an attempt to avoid all the doctrinal disputes that have grown up since the first century of Christianity, and to kind of go back and rely on Christ's admonition in the gospel according to John. By this shall they know that you are my disciples, that you love one another. So we're gonna take all those arguments about transubstantiation and the Trinity and what's Christ is. We're just going to get rid of all that stuff, and we're just going to focus on this first century concept that we're just going to love one another and try and help each other. The moral teachings of the Oxford group were called the Four Absolutes. Now, we're going to go through a couple of things here, and it looks like a quick sketch. The Oxford group was a sophisticated organization with a sophisticated belief system, a sophisticated way of doing life. There's no doubt about it. But this is the very essence of what people were told and what is written in the books about the Oxford group. There are these three basic things. We start off with the Four Absolutes. They believe that you needed to be living a life that exhibited and was founded on absolute honesty, one that was exhibited and that was founded on absolute purity, one that was exhibited and was founded on absolute unselfishness, and one that exhibited and was founded on absolute love. The Oxford group also had 4 basic spiritual practices. Now, these are going to sound pretty familiar to anybody who's familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12 steps. Sharing our sins and temptations with another Christian, like the 5th step, 4th, 5th step. Restitution to all whom we have wronged directly or indirectly, 8th and 9th step. Surrendering our life, past, present, and future to God's keeping and direction, steps 2 and 3. And listening for God's guidance and carrying it out, 11 and 12. The Oxford group also believed that people could change their lives. They could literally change their lives for the better if they honestly embraced their programs that was based on what they called the 5 C's. The 5 C's were confidence. You're gonna tell somebody these secrets in the equivalent of a 5th step, and those secrets are going to be kept. Confession, you got to be completely honest about everything. You got to lay all your cards on the table and do the whole deal. You got to be in. Can't be half in. You got to be in. Conviction. You have to own the seriousness of your own sins. You got to admit that you had a part of that, and it was a bad thing, kind of thing. Conversion. You need to surrender to God of your own free will, and you need to surrender your will to God. And continuous. You need once you got those four things in place, you need to continue working. You got to be trying to help other people to change. So it was exactly those Oxford group teachings, along with Bill Wilson's own personal white light experience, that Bill was preaching to the drunks when he was trying to save them at Towns Hospital between December of 1934 and April of 1935, the first few months of his own personal extended period of sobriety. But he wasn't just running around towns talking up the Oxford group. Bill was so excited about what was going on with him that he took time to write about this Oxford group solution to at least one former patient from Towns Hospital, a guy that he met at Towns Hospital. So in January or February, we're not sure the exact date on this letter, but it's 1935. Bill's 1 month or 2 months sober. He's right out the gate. He's right out the gate. And what you're going to see here is now William James's Varieties of Religious Experience stuff, all right? We're going to see Oxford group stuff over and over and over and over and over again. Bill writes to Roger, someone he'd met before. I don't know if it was at that last visit to Towns or one of the earlier ones, but he writes to Roger. They had both been patients at Towns, and Bill's hard selling the Oxford group. I mean, he is hard selling the Oxford group. And here's what he writes. He says, I had a friend who, now the friend would have been Ebby Thacher. I had a friend who took to firing shotguns around the house, and the neighbors weren't at all sold on the idea. And the judge was about to send him over to the state bug house when there appeared out of the haze 2 members of the so-called Oxford group. They worked on him a bit, brought him to New York, and he is indisputably cured, though he was obviously far beyond any medical aid. The upshot of it all was that, to my amazement, I got religion too. Roger, do you believe it? I got religion too. And I'm spending some time at Towns working with some of these hopeless cases. Of course, there's not been time to demonstrate much of anything. This means I haven't been too damn successful yet. But the doctor is perfectly willing to admit that this Oxford group crowd has a lot on the ball. That would be Dr. Silkworth. So he's letting Bill come in and talk to these people. I love this sentence. Roger, that I am riding on the holy roller coaster may seem incredible to you. Bill Wilson riding on a holy roller coaster. Is that a beautiful thing or what? You know? He's on a religious holy roller coaster, folks. I'm taking the liberty of sending you a book, which has something to do with pushing me personally over, and which will explain more of what happened to me than I might in a bale of paper. Whatever your sentiments, you are bound to be fascinated by a thing as a remarkable human interest story. So he's sending Roger this letter, telling him he's on the holy roller coaster, telling him he's got religion, and he's sending him a book about it. Now, we don't know what book he sent, but because he told Roger that you're bound to be fascinated by the book as a remarkable human interest story. I mean, there's a whole bunch of Oxford group books, but most of them are more on the textbook level. I'm almost certain that the book he sent was Vic Kitchen's book, I Was a Pagan, because it certainly fits that bill. This is what a first edition of this book looks like. I Was a Pagan, a book on the Oxford group. It's a story about Vic Kitchen. He was a New York guy who was a drunk who got sobered up in the Oxford group by surrendering to Jesus Christ. That's exactly what he did. And that's this book is, if you've never read this book and you're interested in what was going on in mid-New York, mid-1930s in New York City, this is in the Oxford group. This is a fabulous, fabulous read. It's an easy read too. It's a good book. So come on. Let's leave behind this idea that Bill Wilson rolled out of bed and all of a sudden he was selling God as we understand him and choose your own conception of God. Let's leave that behind and call a spade a spade. At this point of his early sobriety, Bill Wilson was staying sober with Jesus. And I say Jesus pointedly because if you say Bill Wilson was staying sober with God, 95% of the people in Alcoholics Anonymous been around a while. They hear the word God, they hear God as we understand him. God as we understand him. Choose your own conception of God. That's what we hear. So I didn't say Bill Wilson was staying sober with God. Bill Wilson was staying sober with Jesus because that's what he was doing. He was in a Christian organization up to his neck. And there's not a hint of the liberal William James yet. Within the Oxford group, Bill participated in small groups of men that were formed. 10 or 12 guys got together for guidance for one another. Interesting to me, they didn't get guidance from God for themselves. They got guidance from Harry. They got guidance for Harry sitting across the room for them. I've got some guidance for you that God just sent me, Harry. And according to Lois, the Oxford group, as we knew it back in the early months of 1935, right after Bill gets sober in December of 34, worked in teams of 6 to a dozen, sitting quietly together and listening for the guidance of God for each other. Bill belonged to a team for a while, but I didn't. The rest of the team would get guidance for him to work with such and such a person in order to bring him to God. Bill usually had different guidance and felt no identity with the person they had selected. Supposedly they were sending him down to Wall Street, where he had connections to bring some of those rich guys to bring them to God. Lois says, Bill, he became a bit annoyed at being told what to do. Can you imagine an alcoholic being annoyed at being told what to do? He knew that he could be far more useful working with alcoholics with whom he could identify. So years later, Wilson, with the clarity of hindsight, said that the problem was that the Oxford group wanted to save the world. Well, they most certainly did want to save the world, but I only wanted to save the drunks. And that's certainly where his life ended up. It wasn't where it started right here, but it's certainly where it ended up. The very beginnings, Bill Wilson has to break away from the Oxford group before we get to anything vaguely resembling today's Alcoholics Anonymous. The very beginnings of Bill's turning away from a total reliance on the Oxford group can be placed in the days just before he left for a business trip to Akron in April of 1935. This is where he meets Dr. Bob for the very first time. In the previous 4 months, he got nobody sober. Didn't get anybody sober in the first, but as he was preparing to leave this missionary work that he was doing at Towns Hospital behind in the pursuit of this new and very lucrative career that awaited him if he was successful in a proxy fight out in Akron, Ohio, he complains bitterly to Dr. Silkworth over the failure of all his efforts during the past 4 months. I haven't gotten anybody sober, Doc. I don't know what's going on here, but it's just I haven't gotten anybody sober. And the doctor advised him to, quote, stop preaching at them and give them the hard medical facts first. Medical, stop preaching. Let's go to medicine first. That may soften them up a depth so that they're willing to do anything to get well. Once they get the medical facts and they realize how they're never going to get sober without some sort of help, then they may be able to accept those religious ideas of yours and even a God. But placing a strong emphasis on the medical aspects of alcoholism was directly contradictory to the Oxford group belief that they already had a purely religious solution for curing alcoholism. They didn't want to be talking about medicine here. They wanted to be talking more about Jesus. Out in Akron, while Bill was fruitlessly chasing the presidency of the National Machinery Rubber Company, he got powerfully thirsty one day, pacing up and down the Mayflower Hotel, and he realized that although he had not been able to get anyone else sober in the past few months, clearly working with alcoholics was what had kept him sober. And he got scared he was going to drink again. And he thought, this is really, to my mind, this is the very first small seed that presages the growth of the fellowship that is to come. Bill realized that if he wanted to stay sober, he needed to be talking to an active alcoholic. As it says in our book, when all other measures failed, the white light experience wasn't keeping him sober at the Mayflower Hotel that day. When all other measures failed, work with another alcoholic would save the day. And Bill, that was his first inkling of that idea, picks up the phone, blah, 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 ends up with Dr. Bob a couple of days later. On May 12th, 1935, Bill Wilson meets with Dr. Bob Smith. And for the first time, he put Dr. Silkworth's advice into practice. This is what Wilson wrote in the foreword to our second edition. He said, when the broker, Bill Wilson, gave him, Dr. Bob, Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy of his malady with a willingness he had never before been able to muster. So we add the medical up front, and then we get to the spiritual. He sobered up and never drank again up to the moment of his death in 1950. So now we got two guys who are sober in Akron, Ohio. And what do they do to stay sober? Well, the two men, again, according to the foreword in the second edition, the two men set out to work almost frantically upon alcoholics arriving in the ward at Akron City Hospital. This was solidly based on Bill's newfound realization that when all other measures failed, work with another alcoholic would save the day. And over the next 10 weeks, these two men sobered up 3 more men. So now we've got 5 guys sober in Ohio. And what's their plan? sober up more guys by hitting them with hard medical facts. Then have them get on their knees and surrender to Jesus. And then take them to a bunch of Oxford group meetings. That was the plan, and that's what they were doing. So that's where we are when Bill goes back to New York after 4 months out in Akron, Ohio. And do we have anything like today's open-ended AA yet? No. What we got are 4 guys sober out in Akron and 1 sober in New York, and he's just lost the best job opportunity come his way in many years. And all of these guys are still deeply immersed in the Oxford group. The only meetings they're going to are Oxford group meetings where alcoholics are typically in a minority. And according to all reports, the ones that were happening out in Akron, for sure we have reports on, they weren't even talking about alcohol in those meetings. They were reading from the New Testament and doing Jesus stuff. In short, now all 5 of them are staying sober with Jesus, and we still don't have a single glimmer of William James yet. Well, Bill goes back to New York, so he's got this new confidence in this first hit them with the hard medical facts approach and then get them to surrender to Jesus. And it works. It works. It's this modified Oxford group gospel of recovery that Bill is preaching at Towns Hospital starts to get people sober. It worked first with Hank Parkhurst in Towns Hospital in September of 1935, and then in November of 1935 with Fitz Mayo. And the story of the atheistic Hank on his knees surrender is told in the big book, in his big book story, The Unbeliever, which is in the first edition. And the prominence of the Oxford group teachings are especially well described in the first draft version of Fitz Mayo's story for the big book. Now, today's Fitz's story is called Our Southern Friend. His first draft was called Me and John, meaning me and John Barleycorn. And I've seen the first draft of this up in Stepping Stones, and it's an amazing document. It's nothing like the story that appeared in the big book in April of 1939. So according to this first draft of Fitz's story, which he wrote in May of 1938, a patient at Towns Hospital says to Fitz, he says, "There are men on the streets of New York today who are worse than you, and they don't drink anymore." Fitz wondered, how could that possibly be true? And the man asked, well, would you be willing to try to live on a new basis, to try and live up to ideals, by trying to be, wait for it, trying to be absolutely honest, absolutely pure, absolutely unselfish, and absolutely loving in all your relations with your fellow men to get rid of this drink problem? Here's the solution. Here's the Oxford Group solution to the drink problem. Of course I would, Fitz, as I declared without much thought. I'd do anything. And then the man says, well, then your troubles are over, said the man, and he left the room. Now, that version with all those Oxford Group absolutes was written in May of 1938, but by the time the multilith, there was a pre-publication copy, offset printed, multilith copy printed in February of 1939, less than 2 months before the book was printed. But by the time the multilith gets printed, that story's been changed to read as follows. Then the guy asked me if I believe in a power greater than myself. Oh, not Oxford Group. Then he asked me if he was willing to right all the wrongs I had ever done to anyone, no matter how wrong I thought they were. Am I willing to be honest with myself, about myself, and tell someone about myself? And am I willing to think of other people instead of myself and of their needs, and to get rid of the drink problem? And I'd do anything, I reply. So between May of 1938, when Fitz writes his first version, and he's doing all Oxford Group stuff, and February of 1939, when this version comes out, in between there, in the December, in between May 38 and April 39, Bill Wilson had written the 12 steps. They weren't even around when he wrote the May 1938 story. By the time we get to the multilith and the book being printed in April, Fitz's story and his story of what happened to him, of what was told to him when he was in Towns Hospital in November of 1935 has changed radically. The Oxford Group also did these cool things. They held these large gatherings that they called house parties. The Oxford Group team organized these parties where people came to relate their experience with the group way of life. It was a way to reinforce those practices and also to sell it to newcomers who might be invited to this thing. And attendance was frequently done by printed invitation that were sent to key people in the community. And Bill and Lois attended several of these house parties in 1935, the year after Bill got sober, first full year of sobriety in 1936. In late December of 1935, so Bill's just 1 year sober. He's 1 year sober, and he attends a very, very large house party in Richmond, Virginia. Travels down to Virginia to do this house party. And Frank Bookman, the man who founded the Oxford Group, and Sam Shoemaker, the head of the Oxford Group, not only in New York City, but in the United States of America, both of those guys are in attendance. They are the movers and shakers in this thing. And they're at this house party in Richmond, Virginia. And while he's down there, Bill writes to Lois and he said, "Darling, I'm really quite happy I came, and I've begun to feel much better, though I'm determined to get to bed early. It is now noon, and morning having been taken up mostly by Frank Bookman, who is so sane, yet possessing great power. He is much on the lookout for practical, two-fisted people who know what things are about and willing to do something." There's a little program of action thing going on there, a little pragmatic program of action. There can be little fear in the way of restraint from him. Looks like there will be never-ending series of meetings, and one is starting right now. Much love, Bill. Little short note from Bill Wilson to his wife. Further proof of this total immersion of the early New York group into the Oxford group can be found in this letter that Hank Parkhurst, who was a flaming atheist, just a few months. Read the story. The unbeliever, flaming atheist, just a few months earlier, he writes this letter to Sam Shoemaker early in his sobriety about his plan on how Sam, if he pays attention, can go about making the Oxford group much more effective and widespread than it is at the moment. February 1936, Hank is 5 months sober. He sends Sam this plan for changing America, and he says, "Having been a businessman, I know that the American people like organization. An army on the march needs coordination, and God needs a spark plug to bring the American machine to life." And he follows this with a fairly detailed 13-point plan. And he concludes by telling Shoemaker, he says, "Look, Sam, if there's any idea here that might be the basis of helpful conversation, I am at your command." In short, Sam, between the lines, if you really want the Oxford group to really change America, then I'm the spark plug you're looking for, man. I'm your organization guy. Lois's diary contains some really wonderful details on these house parties that she and Bill attended. So they go to this Pocono house party just over the Hudson on the other in New York State, on December 4th through 6th in 1936. And Bill's now 2 years sober. This is almost exactly his 2-year sobriety date. She also wrote about some of the guidance that she received at this gathering. So you go to these meetings and you write down, when you're doing your quiet time, you write down the guidance you get from God, and Lois's notes are preserved in her diary. So here's a couple of things that she wrote down about this Pocono house party. List of sins: feeling of being special, self-consciousness, big problem. There's a sin. Feeling of inferiority in contact with people, but superiority of actual worth. There's a kind of reformulation of the egomaniac with the inferiority complex. Self-indulgence in small things, dependence on human love. Sin binds and deadens. Big emphasis on sin. This is a list of sins. And what's another sin? Doubting of Christ. There's a sin for you. Of course, it's nonsense to be doubting Christ, but there it is. It's a sin. 5 weeks later, Lois's diary notes that they've attended another house party. This is a house party at West Point, January 10th, 1937. And once again, she records her own thoughts and convictions that others had pointed out to her. She says, "Anyone criticizes me, I'm immediately angry. Fear of giving up that special private citadel, oneself. Not think about myself all the time." Well, there's a concept. Not sink, I love this, not sink way down in my chair so Bookman can't see me to call on me. So Frank Bookman's at this meeting at West Point. Fear of all kinds will disappear if self is forgotten. There's a little resonance here of selfishness, self-centeredness that we thought was the root of our problem, huh? Unfortunately, if Bill ever made any kind of similar notes at these meetings, and I suspect he did, but they have not been preserved in the archive. Unfortunately, would I love to see those notes? But whatever work was being done in the still unnamed Alcoholics Anonymous to get people sober, all of those efforts were being done deep within the belief and practices of the Oxford group still. In New York, when Bill Rudell gets sober in February of 1937, okay, so we're up to 1937, we are 2 years and 2 months after Bill got sober, okay? And Dr. Silkworth, Rudell's at Towns Hospital, and he says, "Look, if you want to stay sober, you got to go talk to Bill Wilson. If you want to stay sober, you got to do that." So Rudell and his wife, Kathleen, go visit the Wilsons, and after dinner, According to a letter he wrote to Bill Wilson, he said, Kathleen and I knelt down in front of the fireplace in your upstairs parlor with both you and Lois and I made my surrender. So we're still doing on your knees surrender in New York City in February of 1937. Bob Evans gets sober the same month, February 1937, out in Akron. And this is what he said about the Akron meetings at that time. He said, quote, the group demanded an on your knees surrender. You couldn't go to a meeting unless you did it. Akron, they wouldn't let you into the meeting until you got on your knees and surrendered to Jesus. If by accident you didn't make your surrender in the hospital, you had to make it in the upper bedroom over the Williamses' house where the Wednesday night meeting was held, just before the regular Wednesday night meeting began. And this is Earl Treat's description of the first meeting. His first meeting had happened in April of 1937. Now, this is 2 months after Bill Rudell has surrendered in New York and Bob Evans has surrendered in Akron. And he says, I remember most distinctly the first meeting that I attended. It would have been April 37. Bill Dotson, who was AA number 3, Bill Dotson sat with the Holy Bible in his lap. The meeting was opened with a prayer. Bill read excerpts from the Bible and translated them into everyday life. After a half hour or so of this, the meeting was thrown open to everyone in the room, and they in turn picked up some of these passages from the Bible that he was discussed and gave their interpretation. So in our meeting, a belief in God was very definitely a fact. It was a spiritual program. And you got to note that those readings from the Holy Bible were all from out of the New Testament. We're talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, with probably some St. Paul epistles thrown in. So in our meetings, a belief in God was a belief in Jesus. Further, well, the Akron group continued to be deeply immersed in the Oxford group, the Akron group, in the Oxford group for the next 3 years. And I can think of no better example of this than Clarence Schneider's story of his surrender to Jesus. So it's February of 1938. So now we're going fast forward another year. We're just, what are we? We're a year and 2 months away from the publication of the Big Book here. A year and 2 months from the publication of the Big Book. Clarence has to give his surrender with Dr. Bob in the hospital. And Dr. Bob says, there's a whole bunch of guys have been coming by, 10 or 12 guys come by to talk to him, but they don't give him the secret. So Bob finally comes, he's the closer. Bob's going to be the closer. And Clarence begs him to tell him what the secret is. And he says, you got to get on, you got to pray, and you got to surrender to Jesus. And he says, I don't know how to pray. And Bob says, you and I are going to get down on our knees right now, and I'll tell you how to do this. So they both get down on their knees, and Dr. Bob coaches him by saying, this is Clarence's own quote for what happened to him in February 1938 in the hospital in Akron, Ohio. Dr. Bob coaches him by saying, Jesus, this is Clarence Schneider. He's a drunk. Clarence, this is Jesus. Ask him to come into your life. Ask him to remove your drinking problem and pray that he manage your life because you are unable to manage it yourself. When Clarence showed up at his first meeting in Akron after he gets out of the hospital, he was immediately handed a piece of paper by one of the most sober men there, and the piece of paper read, therefore, if any be in Christ, he is a new creature. All things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. Right out of Paul's 2 Corinthians 5:17. Clarence said he broke down crying when he read that. Clarence's wife, Dorothy Schneider, the wives all went to the meeting. This is her description that she gives to Bill Wilson in an interview they did in 1954 of a typical 1938 meeting in Akron. So this is after February of 1938 at some point because Clarence didn't get sober until February 1938. She said the men would all disappear upstairs. And then after about half an hour or so, down would come the new man, shaking, white, serious, and grim, and all the people who were already sober would come down, trooping down after him. They were pretty reluctant to talk about what had happened, but after a while, they would tell us that they'd had a real surrender. We got us a real surrender up there tonight. She says, I often wonder how many of the people that come in now would agree with the Oxford group's version of the Word of God or anything spiritual and really survive an experience like that. It was a regular, old-fashioned prayer meeting. Indeed, it was. So while Akron AA continued to along these rigidly religious lines for years to come, and really, if you go out to Ohio today, Ohio members will frequently quote the four absolutes to newcomers as an essential part of their recovery. I've been there, seen that, done that, had that in my face. Things finally began to move in a more spiritual direction in New York City starting in the spring of 1937. Finally, we're going to start moving in a more spiritual, involving in a more spiritual direction here. The first really serious shift from religious to spiritual in Alcoholics Anonymous began when the New York group severed all their ties. They cut all their ties with the Oxford group in April or May of 1937. The New York group had already been moving away from a strictly religious approach well before the spring of 1937. This wasn't one of those, oh, one day that we're in and the next day we're out thing. Like everything, these things happen gradually, a little bit here, a little bit there, but then there's a break. And we had a break in the spring of 1937 that was abrupt and complete. Bill realized, he said, at that point that most men, he said, they, quote, had to be led, not pushed. They just wanted to find sobriety and nothing else. They clung to all their other defects, letting go only little by little. They simply did not want to get too good too soon, just wanted to stop drinking. This break with the Oxford group was both radical and profound. Bill admitted that the Oxford group had clearly shown us what to do, but just as importantly, the Oxford group they'd also learned from the Oxford group what not to do as far as alcoholics were concerned. So that meant that most of the specifically religious aspects associated with the group, the Oxford group, along with their more authoritarian practices, such as team guidance and the four absolutes, were soon dropped in New York City. Another serious shift from religious to spiritual in the New York group came when Jim Burwell, the famous New York atheist, first got sober on January 8th, 1938. So here's Jimmy, here's our hero. He's 3 years younger than Bill Wilson. He's born in 1898. He gets sober January 8th, 1938. He drinks on June 11th. So he stays sober for 6 months. He drinks on June 11th, 1938. He lasts 1 week out there. He lasts 1 week. He really crashed and burned big time. He gets sober again on June 18th, 1938. And he dies sober September 8th, 1974. So Jimmy was, after Bill Wilson died in January of 1971, Jimmy was the oldest surviving guy from those very, very early days in Alcoholics Anonymous for the next 3+ years. Now, Bill described Jimmy's impact on the New York group in this little handwritten story that my lady Sarah, my wife, discovered when we were up in the Stepping Stones archive. Billy, it's all handwritten. Bill had written Jimmy across the top. This is Bill's description of Jim Burwell coming into New York City AA in early 1938. Like a 4-ton bomb, the new member exploded among our small group. As we were then very young, no one had ever seen anybody like Jimmy. Jimmy knew just what he wanted. He was after. He wanted to stop drinking. There was no doubt about it. Enthusiastic, sincere, aggressive. He was all of these, but Jimmy was a man of fixed ideas, very fixed, as we soon discovered. Rising to his feet at a meeting, Jimmy stridently declared, "Damn this God business. It's the bunk. I don't need it to make this program work, and neither does anybody else. It's a lot of superstition. We ought to stand on our own feet, get honest, and work with other alkies. That's enough program, enough. Let's skip the God stuff." And so, Bill says, this trouble started. Was it not our experience that we must live by spiritual principles or drink and so die? Of course it was. The spiritual angle was the heart of the program. Some of us had been unbelievers, but we'd come open-minded to the group and had acquired faith. But here was a guy shouting that the very grace by which we were living was ridiculous. We tried every conceivable means of bringing Jimmy around. Gentle remonstrance, angry argument, condescending pity, the advice that he was destroying our newcomers' chances by his awful heresy, exclusion from our councils, and finally, the threat of expulsion from our group. None of these devices worked. As well softened cold steel in a candle flame. The fact is that Burwell would never have been allowed to even attend a meeting in Akron without first giving his surrender, and that was not going to happen. Jimmy Burwell was not going to be getting on his knees and surrendering to Jesus. But he was accepted, however reluctantly, in New York City, speaks loudly for the very real differences between these two emerging models for AA's program of recovery in early 1938. Speaks loudly. But all of these changes, all of these things that were going on, leaving the Oxford group and Jimmy Burwell being taken in, were about to become much, much, much more important, because on May 20th, 1938, just 1 month after they left the Oxford group and 4.5 months after Jim Burwell got sober, Bill Wilson started to write the big book. May 20th, 1938, Bill Wilson starts writing the big book. So we're not going to have any more word of mouth program, which is, could be just about anything. It's whatever Harry says or whatever Jim says or whatever Jack says. Or Now things are going to be written down in concrete black and white terms. And we're going to have to live with them going forward. Bill began by writing just 2 chapters. There is a solution and Bill's story. Now, as far as Bill's story goes, there couldn't be too much argument with a man's version of his own story. It's kind of autobiographical. But when Wilson began to write There Is a Solution, after he wrote Bill's story, Hank Parkhurst was not happy with what he was writing. Most especially, he thought it was far, far, far too religious. Hank was advocating for a book based on moral psychology. Hank who? Okay, here's my hero, boy. Henry G. Parkhurst. There's that handsome devil. Yeah, I call him the co-founder who drank. Hank drank in September of 1939, just months after the book came out. Never got sober again. I've already mentioned him here several times, but now he answers the story in 2 profoundly important ways. One of the things I say all the time when I talk about Hank Parkhurst and his impact and his importance to Alcoholics Anonymous is no Hank, no big book. Without Hank Parkhurst, we would not have been publishing a book on April 10th, 1939. Anyway, in any kind of book, it just wouldn't have happened. Sooner or later, I'm sure we would have had a book of some sort, but the book we got was a book that we got because Hank Parkhurst was constantly lighting fires under Bill Wilson to do it, and he was constantly arguing with Bill Wilson about what was going to be in it. No Hank, no big book. And on top of that, without him, no religious to spiritual, which is what we're talking about here today. This is where we really start getting into this shift from religious to spiritual when things start getting down written in black and white, and people are arguing what it says in black and white, most especially Hank Parkhurst. Nothing had more impact on the final text of the big book than this religion versus moral psychology argument. This is the kickoff argument they had in the very beginning. But exactly what is this moral psychology Hank's advocating for here? What's this guy talking about? So here's Dr. Silkworth. Here's our Dr. Silkworth. Moral psychology was Dr. Silkworth's solution to the alcoholic compulsive drinking problem. That was what he thought the solution was. He famously mentioned in the doctor's opinion, without ever explaining it in the doctor's opinion, he said 2 places. He said, we doctors have realized for a long time that some form of moral psychology was of urgent importance to alcoholics. And then later he said, we felt, he's talking about Hank Parkhurst, we felt Hank's only hope would be through what we then called moral psychology. And we doubted if even that would have any effect. He was such bad shape. So exactly what is this moral psychology that Silkworth's talking about? In an article that Silkworth wrote in 1937 called Reclamation of the Alcoholic, which was published in the Medical Journal, Silkworth detailed his suggested treatment for alcoholics in 4 sections. There was 4 different sections in the article, and the last of these was boldly entitled Moral Psychology. And this is what it said in that article. Moral psychology. We believe that this decision is in the nature of inspiration. We're making a decision here, kind of like that decision in the 3rd step, but we're making a decision to adopt moral psychology. The patient knows he has reached a lasting conclusion and experiences a sense of great relief. The guy's hit bottom. He's done. These individuals, introverts for the most part, I always have to clarify. I always think of an introvert as somebody who's quiet and off in the corner, all by themselves. But that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about people who are so self-centered that all they pay attention to is themselves. These individuals, introverts for the most part, whose interests center entirely in themselves, once they have made their decision, frequently ask, how can I help others? Well, let's be helpful to others. Let's be useful to others. Let's do all of that stuff. So it was exactly this kind of solution, a psychological solution that Hank was suggesting Bill should be emphasizing when he was writing There Is a Solution. After all, he says to Bill, this Dr. Silkworth solution, what's the problem here? How come we're not going with Silkworth's solution? And so the Hank-Bill arguments begin. Bill's writing the first version of There Is a Solution, and Hank's jotting down what Bill called his ideas about what that chapter should and shouldn't say. And the archives hold 11 handwritten pages like this. This is the first one. That's all Hank's handwriting on the top. And at the very bottom, it says Hank's ideas. That's Bill Wilson's handwriting. So Hank wrote the stuff up and gave it to Bill. So we don't have time to do all of them. There's some great stuff in there, but I think it's important to look at what Parkhurst was getting Bill Wilson's face about in June of 1938 as he's writing There Is a Solution. He says, one of the easiest and most talked about things among us is a religious experience. I believe that this is incomprehensible to most people. Simple and meaningful words to us, but meaningless to most of the people that we're trying to get this over to. In my mind, religious experience, religion, etc., should not be brought in. I like this sentence. We are actually irreligious. We are actually irreligious, but we are trying to be helpful. Moral psychology. We have learned to be quiet, to be more truthful, to be more honest, to be more unselfish, moral psychology, to make the other fellow's troubles our troubles, moral psychology. And by following 4 steps, most of us have had a religious experience. We do that stuff and then we get the experience. The fellowship, moral psychology, the unselfishness, moral psychology, appeals to us. I wonder if we're on the wrong track here, Bill. I really wonder. A very good merchandising procedure is to find out why people do not buy our products, and it is good reasoning to find out why. I am fearfully afraid that we are emphasizing religious experience when actually that is something that follows as a result of 1, 2, 3. In my mind, the question is not particularly the strength of the religious experience as much as the improvement over what we were. So the essence of this argument between Bill and Hank is that Bill believes you must first have a vital spiritual experience, like his white light experience, and in order to start living a life based on moral psychology. He's on board with the moral psychology thing, but it's a cart coming after the horse. Hank believes it happens to have exactly the other way around. You practice moral psychology, and that gets you a spiritual awakening. That may not sound like much of a difference, but it's a big difference. This is an incredibly important argument. It goes on between these two guys from June of 1938 right up until April of 1939 when the book was published, Religion versus Psychology. Bill was not completely insensitive to these suggestions. He was paying attention to what he could, but rather than eliminating his very pointed religious slant in the text, he began by blending Hank's perspective on moral psychology into these 2 chapters, Bill's story, and there's a solution that he's writing. There's just a couple of examples. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness, moral psychology, and my usefulness to others. And perhaps I could help some of them and enlarge his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others. And helping other alcoholics was the point. 4 references out of Bill's story. There is a solution. He talks about being so happily and peculiarly useful to others. And he talks about enhancing our usefulness to others, and our very lives as ex-alcoholics depend on the constant thought of others and how we may help meet their needs. And, we don't need to worry about his future usefulness and nor anything, whatever, except the sincere desire to be helpful and to lay at the feet of another the same simple kit of tools. So this incorporation of Hank's insistence on the importance of moral psychology to sobriety continued right throughout Bill's writing of the rest of the book. And any careful reading of the first 164 pages will reveal no less than 72 explicit references to the importance of being useful and helpful to others. Hank Parker's moral psychology is right there in the big book, page after page after page, in plain sight if you just look for it. In addition, Hank never stopped arguing for his own much less religious vision of the big book's message. And over the coming months, he had some significant difference. Now, we got several different versions of There Is a Solution. Bill wrote the first one in June of 1938, and then there's 3 more versions that have been preserved in the archive before we get to the multilith copy. And these things allow us to accurately trace the positive influence that Hank's arguments had in changing some of the specific mentions of the religious to a more inclusive spiritual. This is when, so again, we're putting stuff down in black and white. So your word choice is incredibly important here, and that's what they're arguing over. At the moment, they're arguing over those 2 words. In his first June 1938 version of There Is a Solution, Bill wrote the word religious appeared 13 times, and the word spiritual didn't show up at all. Didn't make an appearance at all. A lot of religion in that first version. By the time the book was published in April 39, these numbers had changed dramatically. Religious shows up now just 7 times, and at no point, it's all when he talks about religious people, for instance, ministers and things like that. None of those 7 things are directly related to the solution, whereas the word spiritual has replaced religious 7 times. And here's some examples. When therefore we were approached by others on whom the problem had been solved, there was nothing left for us to do but to accept the proposal placed before us. And that was changed to, we're going to include a little spiritual. There was nothing left for us to pick up the simple kit of spiritual tools laid at our feet. Or this is the great fact is just this and no less, that all of us have had a deep and effective religious experience. And that got changed to, we have all had deep and effective spiritual experiences. And some new sentences were added. All of a sudden, we got this thing about into others and to accept spiritual help. That was the problems of guys had to accept spiritual help, not religious help. And some of our alcoholic readers may think that we can do without spiritual help. not religious help, spiritual help. Let us tell you the rest of the conversation that our friend had with the doctor. So this gets changed. And this is the conversation between Roland Hazard and Dr. Young. And Young says, sporadically, here and there, once in a while, alcoholics have had what are called vital religious experiences. Now, the first version that Bill Wilson writes in this conversation, he puts those words into Dr. Young's mouth, vital religious experiences. But when the book gets published, it's been changed to vital spiritual experiences. Different thing. His hope was promptly dashed by the doctor. This is Roland, who told him that his faith and his religious convictions were very good as far as they went. But in that case, they did not spell the vital religious experience so absolutely imperative to displace his insanity with respect to matters alcoholic. And that, of course, gets changed to, in his case, they did not spell the necessary vital spiritual experience. I love these. We must have a vital religious experience of parish and his newly found religious experience. Those two sentences were cut completely. And then they put this whole new paragraph in, which ends with, surprisingly enough, we find such convictions no great obstacle to a spiritual experience. And finally, I love this. So with this very ending, the next few chapters are the personal narratives of several of us. In these accounts, each person will describe in his own language and from his own point of view, the way in which he happened to find the living God. And that gets changed to, from his own point of view, the way he established his relationship with God. Although I do not believe that Bill Wilson embraced William James's Varieties of Religious Experience during the earliest days of his sobriety, as I think we've seen with clarity here. But by the time he started writing the big book in June of 1938, it had certainly made some significant impressions on him. And the program of recovery in New York City also was being practiced with this more liberal approach coming on. Jimmy was there, so they had to put up with him and come up with some sort of explanation for how come that was working for him. The earliest version we have of There Is a Solution contains this following reference to William James. The distinguished American psychologist, William James, in his book, Varieties of Religious Experience, indicates a multitude of ways in which men have discovered God. We have no desire to convince anyone that there is only one way by which faith can be acquired. If what we have learned and felt and seen means anything at all, it means that all of us, whatever our race, creed, or color, are the children of a living creator with whom we can form a relationship upon simple and understandable terms as soon as we are willing and honest enough to try. It's important to note that however open-ended this may sound, the only variety Bill is offering here is a belief. He's not offering a variety of religious experiences. He's talking about a variety of religious beliefs. He's offering a belief here. And that belief, the only variety he's offering, is in a providential creator God with whom you can form a direct and personal relationship, a providential God, one who you can pray to and get some help from. In late May of 1938, just before writing There Is a Solution, Bill had written 2 long versions of his own story, and here's the first time that we find this phrase, God as I understand him, in the written records. I think it's questionable that Ebby ever said this to him in 1934, but we don't have time to go into that argument. That's a real quicksand argument. But in the very first version Bill wrote in May of 1938, okay, he's writing about what happened in 1934, December 1934. He says that Ebby instructed him to turn my face to God as I understand him and say to him with earnestness, complete honesty, and abandon that I henceforth place my life at his disposal and direction forever. In the second version that Bill wrote in May of 1938, he says that at the hospital I was separated from king alcohol for the last time. There I humbly offered myself to God as I then understood him to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. I admitted for the first time that of myself I was nothing, and without him I was lost. All of that other stuff does a very strong definition of the understanding that Bill Wilson had of God at that time, for sure. Note that these 2 earliest appearances of the phrase, Bill is not telling others how to approach their own problem with belief. It's all about how he understood them, now how we understood them. Bill's merely telling a story, albeit an instructive story. It's meant to be an instructive story. It's what Bill Wilson did, was tell instructive parables about what happened to him. But once again, however open-minded this may sound, Bill is not offering belief in any kind of God you like option. It's just not what he's doing here. He's offering any kind of God you like, just so long as that God is a providential God you can form a personal relationship with, one you can pray to and get help from. From mid-June of 1938 to mid-September 1938, Bill doesn't write anything else for the big book. 3 months, they're running around trying to get money based on those first 2 chapters. Nor do we have any other written records that might shed some light on how the religious versus spiritual controversy was progressing during those 3 months. But he did start writing again on September 15th, and by the end of the year, just 3.5 months later, the first draft of the entire book was finished. And the earliest version we have of those other 9 chapters, those final 9 chapters, are found in the pre-publication multilith copy I've already mentioned, printed in late February of 1939. Now, the multilith was offered to AA members, along with doctors, ministers, priests, and psychiatrists for comments and corrections. Some of the suggested changes that were taken just before the big book was published show several shifts from religious to spiritual. For instance, in We Agnostic, God, I love this one. And We Agnostic said originally said to be doomed to an alcoholic hell or to be saved. There's some pretty religious things. Was changed to read to be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis. Thank you for changing that one, Bill. That's good. On the other hand, at least one suggested change deleted an important spiritual. We're on the opening lines of working with others. Practical experience shows that nothing will so much ensure your immunity from drinking as intensive work with other alcoholics. It works when other spiritual crossed out activities fail. I thought that was a really nice, explicit nod to the fact that, Bill's pacing the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel, and the spiritual stuff he's been doing hasn't working for him. He needs something else. So what he does is he goes off and works with another alcoholic. Similarly, not all the suggestions to tone down the God language were taken. This is a great suggestion that rather than saying God, you say a power above us and into action. So somebody was suggesting that when completed, this will mean we had admitted to a power above us, trying to soften it. But all of those weren't taken. Interesting, here are several critical comments on the page about the 11th step. One at the very bottom of the page says, this is absolutely too groupy. Of course, the Oxford group had quiet time every single morning where you listened to God for guidance and you wrote it down. So they didn't like that page on the 11th step. And the words Oxford group and group have been written opposite these offending paragraphs, but there were very few pages that were made to those paragraphs when it was finally published in the big book. But perhaps, and this is really critically important in my opinion, the most important change to the text of the big book emphasized an even greater openness to God as we understand him was Hank Parker's last-minute insertion of 4 critical paragraphs into Bill's story. This is what I mentioned earlier as these things that people just don't want to give up because they're so attached to this happening to Bill Wilson when he was just days sober, still laying in bed in Towns Hospital. But Parker's adds 4 critical paragraphs to Bill's story. And this is what it looks like in Hank Parker's handwriting. These are the 4 paragraphs that he adds. And what are the 4 paragraphs? Here's these 4 critically important paragraphs, especially for people like me. Despite the living example of my friend, there remained in me the vestiges of my old prejudice. The word God still aroused a certain antipathy. When the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. I didn't like the idea. I could go for some conceptions as creative intelligence, universal mind, or spirit of nature, but I resisted the thought of a czar of the heavens, however loving his sway might be. I have since talked with scores of men who felt the same way. Then my friend suggested what seemed a novel idea. He said, why don't you choose your own conception of God? That statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required for me to make my beginning. I saw that growth could start from that point. Upon a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. These 4 critical paragraphs has ever since been cited as proof that Bill was given this very open option for belief at the very beginning of his sobriety. And critical historians seriously question the truth of these paragraphs on 2 bases. First of all, they didn't show up until March of 1939, talking about December 1934. And second, we know for a fact, Ebby was preaching the Oxford group to Bill Wilson in 1934. And the Oxford group wasn't preaching, why don't you choose your own conception of God? The Oxford group was Christian. They believed in the divinity of Jesus Christ. That's what they were about. There are a number of other spiritual rather than religious changes that can be seen throughout the big book. I credit these changes to Hank's constant insistence that Bill toned down the religious terms that he was using. Some of the substitutes used for the word God include a power greater than ourselves and a power beyond ourselves, which shows up 17 times in the big book. Higher power, which comes in twice in the big book. And of course, the inclusion of A's most famous formulation, God as we understand him, which shows up 6 times in the big book. Thank you, Hank Parkhurst. Finally, there's a couple of important last-minute religious versus spiritual changes to the 12 steps before the book finally went to print. In the monthly copy, the 7th step read, humbly on our knees. Got rid of that one. Got rid of that one. And the 12th step, really interesting, the 12th step got a bunch of changes before it got printed. This is the monthly version of the 12th step. Having had a spiritual experience as a result of this course of action, we tried to carry this message to others. A little bit of the Oxford group going on there. We're not just going to save alcoholics, we're going to save the world, to others, especially alcoholics, and to practice these principles in all our affairs. Note that the 12 steps were immediately followed by a strong emphasis on the spiritual. Right after this, the point is, what the point of what? The point of doing the 12 steps. The point is that we are willing to grow along spiritual lines. The principles we have set down are guides to progress. We claim spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. If the word religious was plugged into those 3 spirituals, it would be a completely different paragraph. However, there was immediate problems with that. The result of working the steps was a spiritual experience right off the bat. It was in the first printing. So when the second printing of the big book came out in 1941, the 12th step was changed. Can you believe that? They actually changed something in the big book. It was changed to read, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, rather than course of action. And in that same 1941 printing, the spiritual experience appendix was added to the book, noting that our first printing gave many readers the impression that these personality changes or religious experiences must be, and then personality changes a little psychologically going on there, or religious experiences must be the nature of a sudden and spectacular upheaval, white light kind of thing. Happily for everyone, this conclusion is erroneous. With few exceptions, our members find they have tapped an unsuspected inner resource, which they presently identify with their own conception of a power greater than themselves. I heard an AA speaker one time said he thought that was the saddest sentence in the entire big book. They had tapped we had this unsuspected inner resource we're walking around with all the time. And we had never tapped it till we got here. Most of us think this awareness of a power greater than ourselves is in the essence of spiritual experience. Awareness of a power greater than ourselves is the essence of spiritual experience. Our more religious members call it God consciousness. So this second printing of 1941 brings me really to the end of I'm a primary document guy. I go to the archives and I all over the place, and I look at these things that were written at the time. And I haven't really gone past June of 1939 and a little bit into 40 and 41. So I don't have a lot to give beyond that. But we all know that AA members have greatly expanded their understanding of God as we understand him over the past 82 years. I mean, anybody who's in AA knows that for a fact. Any careful reading of the first 164 pages of the big book reveal at least 114 clear references to Bill Wilson's solution to the alcoholic's problem, and that is the need for a spiritual awakening. That's the solution, not moral psychology. Encouraged by the freedom that they saw offered for them in the spiritual experience appendix, AA members have greatly expanded their understanding of God as we understood him over the past 8 decades, including Group of Drunks, which was Jimmy Burwell's original coinage for GOD, or Good Orderly Direction, or Group Gift of Desperation, or The Great Outdoors even, people use, and a host of other creative solutions. My own personal belief, I rarely do a presentation where I can't fit this in some. My own personal belief is that the essence of the AA message can be boiled down into 2 very simple statements. Number 1, this is Bill Wilson's diagnosis of the alcoholic's problem. Diagnosis. If you're a real alcoholic, you have no defense against the first drink. You don't want to drink. You got no booze in your body. We're not talking about silk where it's, once I start drinking, I can't stop the phenomenon craving. We got no booze in our body, and we pick up the first drink anyhow. You have no defense against the first drink. Wilson's diagnosis of the alcoholic's problem. But a clarification, number 2. But But if you can get yourself a vital spiritual experience, it will likely protect you from picking up that first drink. That's what's going to stand between you and the insanity, that mental blank spot that happens just before you pick up the first drink if you're a real alcoholic. Spiritual experience. Bill Wilson had a very limited understanding of the possible avenues that drunks could take to find a spiritual solution to their drinking problem. His solution was confined solely to the realms of the religious, with a complete dependence on a providential God. But thankfully, this has evolved over time. Thankfully, our collective experience over the past 82 years has vastly expanded our understanding of the wide variety of spiritual solutions that are available to us. Spiritual solutions can very successfully stand between us and that devastating first drink, leading to a life of happy and productive, continuous sobriety. I personally am profoundly grateful to have gotten sober at a time when an ever wider and wider latitude was being offered to newcomers regarding sobriety, spirituality. And perhaps the most helpful advice I ever heard, which I'm going to pass along to you today, is in relation to this much greater openness to what constitutes a spiritual solution, was simply this. I heard a speaker one time, a speaker, he said, identify the places where you encounter the spiritual and go there often. Identify the places where your definition of spiritual is what counts here, not my definition, not anybody else's definition. Identify the places where you encounter the spiritual. Get your radar up, pal, and pay attention to this. And as soon as you identify those places, make damn sure you go there as often as possible, because that's where the solution is. Finally, if you enjoyed this presentation, I got a YouTube channel, Bill Schaberg YouTube channel. Currently offers 13 other presentations done on early AA history, similar to what we just did today. It looks kind of like this. And I want to thank everybody. Thank you.